programs and or positions, there is a list there, but I want to stress it's partial and it's unprioritized. And again, this would be focused more on 2009-10. And I would also add the bullet point to item 6 that is in item 4, which is other suggestions are encouraged from board members, departments, bargaining units, and staff. But we want to focus in specifically on programs. You know, an across-the-board kind of thing doesn't really address the issues. It really is focusing, are there programs that aren't mandated and that could be reasonably cut or reduced in order to save county funds. That's 6. Item 7, delaying the implementation of cost of living adjustments, again, is totally a meet and confer issue. And so there's some background there, but the discussion can't occur during open session. Item 8 has to do with implementing a hiring freeze and review use of extra help. And what we wanted to assure you is, in fact, we have the mechanism already in place for reviewing all positions. And at this point, we are adding another layer of scrutiny in terms of really assuring that there are funds from outside before signing off on those positions. So essentially, we already have the mechanism in place, and we're simply stepping up the review of that. And then implement retirement incentives, otherwise known as golden handshake. I think there's been mixed experience with that, but it usually shows up on these lists, and so it's here. We're not necessarily recommending doing anything with that. Experience being that people who are planning to retire anyway retire more lucratively, and those who weren't planning on retiring don't. So what that does is it brings us to the last 2 pages. I just want to explain how they operate, and then we'll go on to the rest of the staff report. It identifies the potential shortfalls in each of the areas, each of the challenge areas. So, and Meredith will be able to explain the revenue projections, but in Budget Unit 1000, we're projecting a shortfall now of $835,000 due to decreases in receipts attributable to the economy. So they'll go into more detail. You follow the arrow, then it talks about a specific cut or reduction that could address some or all of that. So a recommendation is that part of that insurance payout from Mill Creek dams be not put in contingency, but be applied against that shortfall to reduce it to $500,000. So that's one equation. If you kind of look at these as layers of equations. So the next challenge around potential state cuts, we've listed 4 items that have been on the chopping block before, have survived, are back on the chopping block, and we don't know what the outcome is. It could be that, once again, they are spared, or it could be that this is the time that they actually get cut, and we're not going to know until the state takes action. So we've identified those. The Williamson Act subvention, it's state funds that replace the loss of property taxes to counties when they allow for Williamson Act protection for local property owners who are using their land for agriculture and other related activities. If that's cut out, that money goes straight into the general fund. It's not attributable to any specific department, and so that's how you get, there aren't any corresponding cuts that would go with that, and then it adds to your shortfall balance. The next 3 items are all law enforcement activities, and the state is threatening to cut them. Certainly there's going to be advocacy to spare them, but we just don't know what's going to happen. What is written here is in keeping with county policy. County policy, as expressed by the board, is you don't backfill for cuts of state funds. So in this particular case, these items would be expected to be, there would be reductions in the budget units associated with these items. That is an assumption. And should that be an assumption that either the department doesn't recommend or feel is possible and the board doesn't, then you would have to change those zeros over in the shortfall balance column, because whatever you cannot cut or reduce, would have to be made up in some other fashion. Going on to challenge 3, identified the 4 items that fall in that category. One is sheriff overtime. We've been upfront about the fact that we did not fully budget for overtime. There is a committee focusing on that, and there may be some offsets of other savings in that departmental budget. So right now, in keeping with the budget adopted by the board, there's an assumption that that cost is going to be absorbed within that department. If it's not, then more money will have to be allocated into the department, and that increases your shortfall balance. Fort Bragg Animal Shelter, it's budgeted at a certain level that will require some level of restructuring. And my understanding is this $100,000 is about the difference between that and normal operations. So just being upfront about that issue. The full teeter payment, again, I want to stress that this fiscal year, more money has been put against the teeter principal than in any previous year since the beginning of teeter. What we were not able to do was put the revenues, teeter revenues entirely towards it, and pay the amortization payment on top of that, which would have truly been unprecedented. We are in the process of recalibrating the amortization schedule to account for the fact that revenues from now on are going directly against the teeter principal. So teeter revenues are going against the teeter principal, and so we will restructure the amortization payment for the liability that's beyond the annual liability that comes in, and I'm not going to talk any more about teeter, but that's why that's here. And then the water project. There was a water project that was unfunded, but assumption was made that it was going to be paid out of the contingency reserve, and so that's what's reflected here. So when you get all through the shortfalls, the potential cuts to offset them, you end up with a net balance at the bottom of $1,065,000, and as I said, any changes to that equation will change that bottom line. So then the next page simply talks about choices that could offset that. The options listed above are the ones that can be taken by board and executive office direction, and what we think that will account for the balance of the fiscal year. I want to stress that that's the balance of the fiscal year. And then the option where it talks about board direction and meet and confer, obviously whatever the specifics are will come out of negotiations. But what is important is that the board sets the target of what that shortfall is for this year. And so that's why the previous page is important, because whatever that bottom line is kind of the direction that we're going in with in needing to balance this year's budget given the economic conditions. So that's how this works, and I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer and Meredith to go through the rest. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Question, Supervisor Dover.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And if this is not the appropriate time